going to be a really interesting webinar, and I'm super excited about it. But just to start, I wanted to give everyone a greeting. Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to those of you joining us today for this evening's webinar. My name is Mel Romualdez, and I'm the director of CRAE. As you may already know, here at the Center for Research in Autism and Education, we are a team of autistic and non-autistic staff and students based within UCL's Institute of Education, and we are part of the Department of Psychology and Human Development. Here at CRAE, we aim to conduct high-quality, cutting-edge research, but also to ensure that the results of that research reach those who stand to benefit the most from it. This CRAE webinar series is just one part of that, allowing people both within and beyond academia to hear from some of the key researchers, practitioners, and advocates in the field. Through everything that we do at CRAE, we take a participatory approach, which means we work with autistic people in all stages of our research and initiatives, from the initial design right through to the sharing of the outcomes. We hope that this means that the work we do is meaningful for the wider autistic community. At this point, I'd like to say a big thank you to all of our funders, supporters, and team members who contribute to our work and make it all possible. In particular, a special thank you to Pears Foundation for their generous ongoing support that underpins everything that we do. As always, we invite you in the audience to become part of the conversation, either in the chat or with more anonymity in the Q&A. We will stop recording at that point and will endeavor to have as many questions answered as we can by our speaker. Today, we have the excellent Vinny Carter Leno. Vinny is the Wellcome Trust Career Award Development, Career Development Award Fellow at the Center for Brain and Cognitive Development at Birkbeck College, University of London. She's interested in building understanding of why autistic children are more vulnerable to experiencing mental health difficulties, particularly anxiety. Over to you, Vinny.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to hearing what people think about this kind of new project. And I guess it's not a new strand of research, but what I thought I would structure the talk into, if I can get things working, is I thought part one, I would talk about a summary of some of my previous research on the topic of sensory responsivity and mental health in autism. And then for the second part, I would talk to you about a new grant. I mean, it still feels new to me. I'm actually 2.5 years in, which is really zooming in on this in the early childhood period and using a whole range of different measurement techniques and kind of conceptual models that I think are really interesting. So it's kind of a talk of two halves, if you like. Okay, so the title included the phrase heightened sensory responsivity. Now, I feel like if you're attending this webinar and you're kind of engaging with CRAE, then maybe you do have a sense of what this means. Sorry, I'm just going to check that the chat is everyone. Okay, it's not for me. Everyone can hopefully hear me all right. The phrase heightened sensory responsivity, you might have some idea in your head of what I'm talking about. But sometimes when I go out and talk to people about this in the general public, or if I go to, sometimes I go to libraries or parent groups, it's not something that everyone really knows what I mean when I say sensory responsivity. So what do I mean here? So what I'm talking about is a heightened response, usually or sometimes accompanied as a distress response to everyday sensory stimuli. So this could be finding lights too bright, finding hand dryers too noisy or other auditory inputs, being very sensitive and showing a heightened response to some textures that we might encounter throughout our day. So the label on the back of a t-shirt or certain types of food, finding the texture of them very unpleasant or kind of reacting in a heightened manner to them. And we know that this heightened sensory response is quite prevalent in autism. But interestingly, there has been some quite preliminary work showing that actually in the general population, so not just autistic children, but kind of all children in the population, if you do large-scale surveys, this actually is present in a kind of higher prevalence of children than you would think. I think in some of the more recent estimates, it was about 20%. which is quite high for something that doesn't have a diagnostic label and isn't kind of a clinical phenomena in a kind of official sense, if you want. So, yeah, we're talking about heightened responses to everyday stimuli. We know these things are really prevalent in autism, are present from very early in development, but also are prevalent in a substantial chunk of neurotypical children too. And why would we care about these things? Well, if you ask autistic people, and this is a really lovely quote from an autistic anaesthetist that I know, then it can be a real priority for them. So this quote, she said, "Sensory difficulties are the most fundamental challenge in my day-to-day life." So these things can come with really, these kind of sensory processing or sensory responsivity differences can come with quite negative consequences sometimes, or associations. And when you do kind of larger priority setting exercises with the autism community, this is something that comes out as one of the top 10 priorities that they want researchers to work on. Now, how do we think about sensory responsivity? You know, what are we measuring? What are we talking about? What might be driving these differences that we observe? So it's very excellent taxonomy. What a mouthful. I like to think of it as kind of a framework or a way of thinking about what we're trying to measure or explain for describing the sensory differences of autism. And I've put the paper down below. I'd really recommend giving it a read. I found it very, very helpful in trying to kind of unjumble my thoughts with this complex topic. So when I'm talking about heightened sensory responsivity, what I'm really talking about is what we observe in terms of behavior. So what we see in children, or what people kind of report that they feel, or the way they behave in different situations. And you could think about different explanatory levels that you might try and understand or explain what's driving what we see at the behavioral level. So this could be at a brain level, so sensory related neural excitability, and I'll talk a bit about this later, but there are other levels you could think about it too. But when I'm talking about sensory responsivity, I mean the behavior that we see if we're working with children that we ask parents that they see in their children. Okay, so the first question, before I get onto the brain mechanisms, is kind of the question of like, why does it matter and why is this important? And this is some of my previous work where I got quite interested in the idea that heightened sensory responsivity, or sometimes people in autism research call it sensory hyper-responsivity, sensory over-responsivity, they're all kind of talking about the same thing, just with different labels. There's some evidence they're associated with mental health difficulties. And so I wanted to dig into this a little more. And so there've been some research showing links between poorer child mental health, but also kind of more distal or broader impacts as well beyond the child. So increased parental stress and reduced engagement for the child and their family in kind of everyday activities and education. So you can imagine, you know, as a child, if you're kind of often experiencing these overwhelming and sometimes stressful or distressing responses to everyday sensory stimuli, some environments might be just completely inaccessible to you. So if you imagine, and I'm going to talk more about supermarkets later on, but going to the supermarket or going to a play group or different other public spaces where there can be really unpredictable sensory input, which could trigger a sensory response, which is very distressing for the child. And so then that leads to kind of reduced engagement, or maybe not even going to these places in the first place, these different contexts. So you can kind of theoretically see, also you could see how this would link to anxiety. You know, if you don't know when you're going to encounter something that's very distressing, that could in turn snowball into an anxiety disorder. So theoretically you can understand it, but the eagle eyes among you might see that I've drawn these arrows here with double-headed. And that's because a lot of the research that was out there when I kind of started looking into this had really measured both of these things at one point in time. So they'd measured the response to sensory stimuli, but also, you know, mental health in the child or parental stress at the same time point, normally with a questionnaire, which was normally answered by the same person, usually the parent. And so that kind of limits what we can say about the directionality of effects, what's driving what, how much we think these effects are true versus driven by some sort of bias by having the same person rate them. So I'm not saying that these things aren't good evidence. I'm just saying that there is a limitation to interpretation that you can put upon results using these methods. So what we wanted to do is kind of move beyond this and look at things, A, early in development, and B, look at things where they've been rated at multiple time points. And this is because there was some evidence suggesting, like a few studies, that actually there is a directional link. So it's not that anxiety is driving sensory over-responsivity, as people are calling it here, or hyper-responsivity, but it's the other way around. So the sensory responsivity or activity comes first, and that's then driving anxiety later down the line. And this is where this nice study by Teresa Tabasky's group, when they asked autistic adults, this is kind of how they felt the relationship was between these constructs. And then the two studies above were in toddlers, both autistic on the left by Green et al., and then on the right, the Carpenter paper in the general population had shown directional links from sensory hyperresponsivity. I'm just going to call it that from now on, so I stop switching terms, and anxiety later in life. But these had all looked at kind of toddlers or preschool children. And so what we wanted to do is actually look even earlier in development. So what we did here, and this is work conducted with, she was a PhD student that I was helping to supervise, and now she's fully qualified, Dr. Nisha Navika. And so this was making use of an infant sibling study that was running at Birkbeck, or yeah, it's still running, called Basis Stars. And when I say infant sibling, I mean that infants join the study by virtue of them having a sibling, an older sibling, who either has a diagnosis of autism, a diagnosis of ADHD, a diagnosis of both autism or ADHD, or no family history. Sorry, it's not just sibling. I think they also then included parental diagnosis as the study went on. And these children enter the sample project when they're 5 months, and then they're seen when they're 5, 10, 14, 24, 36 months. And then at 36 months, they do some sort of diagnostic assessments. Not as interested in the diagnostic assessments, so not going to talk about those, but they do have measurement of sensory responsivity and kind of some infant precursors of anxiety that I was very interested in. And so what they have is they have something called the infant toddler sensory profile, which is kind of very well used, widely used parent questionnaire, for which you can measure hyper responsivity, which is the thing I'm primarily interested in, but also it measures, you can get a measure of hypo responsivity. So if hypo is kind of a greater than expected response, hypo is a lesser than expected response. So kind of not responding or showing a much reduced response to what we would normally expect. The classic example would be kind of not responding when touched by someone, or not responding when someone calls your name. Those are kind of the examples, but there are other behaviors in the questionnaire as well they ask about. And then our measure of anxiety. So because the children are so young, you can't really measure anxiety per se in a 10-month-old, but you can measure fearfulness, which is kind of an infant precursor or similar manifestation to later anxiety. And then we also have measurement of autistic traits, because we were interested in how these things relate to kind of infant manifestation of anxiety, so fearfulness, but also do they tell us anything about autistic traits later down the line, and specifically different types of autistic traits? Are differences in sensory response very early in infancy a useful marker for later outcomes? And this is in 161 infants who were seen across these time points here. This looks like a horrible kind of spaghetti diagram. It's basically, it's a structural equation model, but it's just lots of regressions. So we're just looking at the links between these different constructs over developmental time. So on the top row, we have our measure of hypo responsiveness. In the middle, we have our measure of fear. And at the bottom, we have our measure of hyper responsiveness. And what I've highlighted here in red is this was a significant pathway that we had predicted, which goes from hyper responsivity at 14 months to fearfulness at 24 months. But you can see the kind of opposite pathway going from fear at 14 to hyper-responsive at 24 months was not significant. So it's just more evidence that it is maybe the hyper-responsivity that's coming first and potentially contributing to later manifestations of anxiety very early in childhood. And this is across a sample where some of the infants have a family history of autism, some of them don't, some of them will receive a diagnosis, some of them won't. So it is kind of a mixed sample. But still, we see these links here, which I think is quite interesting because it does suggest it could be some sort of transdiagnostic risk factor for poor mental health, but also that these links are there from really early in development, like the first few years of life. We didn't see any links from hyper-responsivity to autistic traits, which is also quite interesting because people think of sensory differences as being very characteristic of autism, but this analysis is saying maybe some types of sensory responsivity are not actually useful in understanding autistic traits or autism outcomes. They're more useful for understanding things like well-being and mental health. Whereas our measure of hypo-responsivity, that was associated with later autistic traits, both in the restrictive repetitive behavior domain and the social communication domain. So maybe kind of not just thinking about sensory processing differences as this kind of global whole, but actually it really matters what type of sensory responsivity we're talking about in terms of what it will tell us about that child later in development. Oh, and there are the highlighted paths that I was just talking about. Okay, and then getting, I suppose, to the meat of the talk is what underpins these individual differences in sensory responsivity? Why is it that some children, some people are more responsive to everyday sensory inputs than others? And, this is about children. This is a kind of autism research is my focus, but it was quite interesting kind of starting the project and really thinking about, just like individual differences in the population where I sit, where my partner sits, where people in the team sit in terms of how responsive they are, the sensory inputs they do and don't like. We're all kind of different, and what could drive that, I think, is a really interesting question. Okay, so now we're zooming back to our taxonomy or our theoretical model and thinking, going in for the neural excitability level. So the idea is something about how the brain is processing these sensory inputs is informative about individual differences in behavior to how people respond to sensory inputs. And funnily enough, this was work way back from my PhD. So it's kind of come full circle because this was over 10 years ago, which makes me feel very old. But my PhD was all about trying to understand mental health difficulties in autistic adolescents. And I was kind of tasked with thinking about all the different, I suppose, risk factors for mental health in autistic teenagers. And one of the things I thought would be helpful to measure or interesting to measure was differences in sensory processing. This was amongst other things, but I thought it was worth it. And actually, it did turn out to be one of the factors that was associated with parent-reported emotional and behavioral concerns. So coming back to this 10 years later, I was like, oh, I guess I already had the kind of kernel of thought for what I'm doing now. And in this paradigm, what we do is you play people. So this is the autistic adolescents here. I'm trying to think, it was about 50 who completed the EEG assessment. You play them a series of auditory tones in the background, and they're basically always the same tone, apart from every now and again you have what we call the deviant stimulus. So it will be like beep, 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 beep. And when you hear that deviant stimulus, you basically get this neural response called the mismatch negativity. You could think of it like the kind of what's that brain response, where your brain picks up that what is being processed or presented to you was different from the ones you heard before. And so the idea was that if your brain response to this new stimulus was larger, maybe that had something to do with you being more sensory sensitive and therefore would be associated with greater emotional and behavioral concerns, which it was. So the MMN amplitude, this is a scatter plot here, was positively associated with what parents were telling us about their level of emotional behavioral concerns in their child. So that's some kind of early evidence that objectively measured metrics of sensory processing are relevant or useful in telling us about variability in mental health in autistic adolescents. Okay, so that's one example. So that was talking about this kind of auditory, what's that response? And then I moved to thinking about other sorts of neural mechanisms. And one thing that people are very, very interested in autism research more broadly is the idea of excitation inhibition balance within the brain. So it's kind of the ratio of excitatory activity to inhibitory activity. And the idea is there's some balance. I mean, you can measure this so many different ways, from kind of individual circuits to a global metric of this ratio. But the idea is this ratio might be somehow different in autistic people. But actually, one thing that people hadn't really looked at is this balance specifically related to sensory processing and sensory responsivity, which to me is a more kind of precise question, because you could see how, especially inhibition, which is meant to be really important for the kind of tuning of your neuronal response. So you don't want everything to fire all the time, because that would be inefficient, but also would be kind of bad. Basically, that's kind of what epilepsy is thought to be, as kind of excitatory and excess of excitatory firing. So inhibition is really important because it will tune your cortical activity to be more specific, to just respond to certain sensory inputs. But actually how these kind of brain metrics of excitation inhibition balance relate to sensory responsivity, people hadn't really looked at that much. And so what I did is I went back to that same sample that I talked about before. So this is the infant sibling cohort who've been seen across their first 3 years of life. So we had these parent questionnaires, but we also had some measurement of brain activity. So here what I did is something called latent growth curve models, which is basically a fancy way of saying estimating change over time. And so what you do is you use the information from these repeated measurements of sensory hyper and hyporesponsivity to each person here. These blue lines gets kind of an estimated trajectory for their change over time between 10 and 36 months. So some people are going up, some people are going down, some people are staying the same. And this is just a way of condensing information, really, to give a kind of summary about these people between 10 and 36 months. So we estimated that for everyone. And then we're interested in, okay, what might predict kind of the shape of these slopes? So what might predict variation in the intercept, which is where you start, and the slope, which is how you change over time. And the first thing I did was just actually looking at, are there differences depending on if you have a family history of autism or a family history of ADHD, before I started delving into the EEG and the brain data. So for hyperresponsivity, which is on my left, I think it's also on your left, there was an effective family history of autism. So this would be the purple slope on the top is infants who have a family history of autism and ADHD. And then orange is infants who have a family history of just autism. And basically these two groups were increasing over time. So parents are reporting more hyperresponsivity as these children get older. Whereas for hyporesponsivity, it's actually the kind of an opposite pattern. So now it's more ADHD, which seems to be important. So again, we have this purple, which is the combined family history of ADHD and autism are increasing over time up here. But actually, it's the green group which are increasing and then ending up high at 36 months. And that's infants who have a family history of ADHD. So no one had really kind of looked at the effect of different forms of neurodivergence on early patterns of sensory responsivity. But this suggests maybe there's kind of a different forms of neurodivergence, whether it's a family history of autism or ADHD, actually might be associated with different patterns of development in terms of sensory responsivity. Okay, and then back to the brain. So what they had measured was kind of a resting state EEG. So this is where the baby's just watching some kind of ambient, slightly interesting videos whilst their brain functioning is being measured using this kind of swimming cap-esque equipment you can see on this child here. And this is basically measuring moment-to-moment fluctuations in cortical activity. And from this, you can apply a kind of algorithm or you can parameterize it to get some marker of excitation inhibition balance. And this marker that people have put forward is called 1 over F, which is basically a way of summarizing the ratio of low frequency to high frequency oscillations in your brain. And so what we're looking at is, do individual differences in this EG marker of excitation inhibition balance relate to what parents are telling us about sensory responsivity? This is just kind of, I like to draw things out. I find it easier to see things visually. So the aperiodic exponent is our marker. That's the kind of official name for this signal, but our marker of EI balance. And these are the things we're seeing if it's associated with. And interestingly, it was associated with parent-report hyper, but also hypo-responsivity at both 5 and 10 months. So we see this positive association here. So that's kind of telling us maybe individual differences in this kind of brain signal of excitation inhibition balance really, really early. So in the first year of life, are relevant to understanding differences in how infants respond to sensory input, but maybe it's not that specific, because it's not like it was just associated with a profile of hyper-responsivity. It seems to be some general difference in your sensory system, which might be linked to differences in EI balance. Okay, so that was kind of a whistle-stop tour through some parts of my research about sensory responsivity. So I hope I've shown some examples that heightened sensory responsivity or sensory hyper-responsivity is longitudinally associated with these increased, these infant manifestations of anxiety. But also there's some evidence that maybe sensory hyper-responsivity is linked to alterations in how we process at a very kind of basic level very, very tiny differences in incoming sensory stimuli, but also maybe something to do with the ratio of excitation to inhibition, inhibitory activity in the brain. So based on these principles, I wrote a new grant, which is what I'm doing now, and that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the presentation. So this was funded by the Wellcome Trust, who I'm endlessly thankful for, and too for funding this piece of work, because it is kind of a big, long project. About something that is relatively novel and we don't know loads about. So the outcome is still heightened sensory responsivity. That's what we're trying to understand. But now what I'm trying to think about is what might drive this. So you could say a risk feature. So maybe people who have some difference in the way that their brain processes incoming sensory information, that is then meaning that they're more likely to show this profile of sensory over-responsivity. I don't think that's too controversial, but actually, evidence for this link is quite lacking. But also I was thinking about models of like child development and psychopathology, and generally a one-to-one mapping between one single factor that can explain some behavior that we're interested in is very, very rare and oversimplistic. So then what I was thinking, okay, well, maybe there's some other components of child development or individual characteristics that are important to think about when trying to explain sensory responsivity. So it's not just, how you're processing sensory input, but one thing that might be really important is how easy or hard it is for you to regulate your arousal when you experience kind of unexpected or novel sensory situations or stimuli. Because you can think that if your profile of sensory, you're processing sensory information in a different manner, but actually if when you encounter things like this, it's relatively easy for you to regulate your arousal, your emotional response, maybe it doesn't actually translate to a very observable difference in how you respond to sensory information versus a child who does have differences in sensory processing and also finds it really hard to regulate their arousal. They might very clearly or more clearly be seen to have a pattern of sensory over-responsivity because it's clearer for parents to see, and that's what they report. So it's just to say that I didn't just want to think about risk, I also wanted to think about things that could be considered resilience features. I wanted to think about this in a transdiagnostic manner, so not just autistic children, but very, very broadly, and I wanted to have really good measurement of these things that went beyond just parent report. And so that's what we're doing at the moment. So our kind of risk feature is differences in sensory processing. So here we're using paradigms quite similar to the ones I was talking about from my PhD. So very, very basic sensory inputs where children are listening to beeps. Well, they're not even listening, they're actually watching Paw Patrol. But we're playing beeps in the background. Every now and again, the beep will change slightly, so it's slightly higher in pitch, or they have tactile little buzzes on their hands, and every now and again, they'll kind of buzz in unison, and we're interested in how much they tune out the second buzz or habituate to it. So very, very basic processes about orienting or habituating. Then with our resilience feature, this is how we're going to measure regulation. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second, because we wanted to do something a bit better and a bit closer to real life than what people have done before. And then sensory responsivity. So we have parents do the questionnaires, and now there are kind of much more in-depth questionnaires that we can use. People have developed them about sensory responsivity, but we also do some observational assessments as well, which are very fun and involve kind of playing with lots of different sensory toys with 3-year-olds. And we're collecting this information from 150 3-year-olds, and we don't have any requirement for diagnosis. So they don't need to have an autism diagnosis to take part, because we didn't want to, 3 is quite young to be receiving an autism diagnosis. I think the median age of diagnosis in the UK is about 6. And so we didn't want to restrict it to individuals who received a diagnosis, because there are barriers and long wait times. So we're kind of happy to take anyone who's interested in it, with some exclusion criteria, but truly not much. Then it was really important to me throughout the project that we did have really good stakeholder involvement from the get-go. So this is something that kind of built on in my PhD and other projects, and then kind of wanted to integrate throughout the whole thing. So we have 2 steering committees. So we have adults who have experienced sensory difficulties themselves, and then we have parents of young children who experience sensory difficulties. It's not arbitrary, but there's a lot of crossover between those groups. So we have adults in the adult group who have young children. We have parents of children who also experience sensory difficulties themselves. I think everyone in our adult group is autistic, and there's a real mix of neurotypes in our parent group. And they have been amazing and so helpful, and really have taken the time to really get into the research with me and help me think about the questions and what we're measuring and the interpretation and how to design things, and generally been extremely helpful. So we see them, I'd say every kind of 3-ish months. It kind of depends on where we're at in the project. At the moment, we're testing, so there's not much to talk about. But we kind of want them to be integrated throughout. And then hopefully when the time comes to talk about our results, they can also help us with interpretation. So this is kind of how the project looks. So we have time 1, which is where we are at now, where we're seeing people when they're age 3, and then they kind of come back a year later when they're 4, and then hopefully they'll come back again when they're age 5. And that means that we can begin to look at these trajectories of change in this really key period, and kind of think about the cascading effects from sensory differences. So this kind of ripple icon is how I was thinking about it when I was writing the grant. So you have some difference in how you're processing sensory inputs, and this in turn could lead to increased anxiety within the child, which could lead to behavioral inflexibility. It makes perfect sense if you're often overwhelmed by things in your environment. Maybe you just try and narrow the type of things you're exposed to kind of keep your arousal within a manageable range. And this in turn could lead to you missing out and not being involved in daily life activities, which are so important for child development, and really every child does deserve to experience. So that was what I was trying to think about in terms of measurement. Okay, so then just to change tack a bit. So when I was thinking about, okay, how am I going to measure how children respond to, or how children process and respond to sensory inputs? So you can do the kind of EEG paradigms that I talked about, where you play these beeps or buzzes on the hands, or show children, boring stimuli basically on a screen in a dark room, and measure their brain activity whilst they do that. And that's fine, that's what everyone does. But it's so far removed from real life. When I was writing the grant and speaking to parents, it's not the type of experiences that they say that their child is maybe struggling with. It's just so, it really lacks ecological validity. And so I wanted to do something a bit better than that. And we do have, really amazing and in-depth information from parents about their child's sensory responsivity. And we have the behavioral observation I talked about. But I thought, actually, could we do a bit better? And at the Centre for Brain and Cognitive Development in the Toddler Lab, they actually have a brand new virtual reality suite, which is basically built for toddlers, which is amazing because you can create kind of any environment that you can think of down there, and then it is like you're in the space when you go down and you walk around, and it feels, I mean, it's not real life, but it feels much more realistic than just something static on a laptop being flashed up or kind of beeps behind you. So that's why I wanted to try and use virtual reality to kind of get us a step closer to actually capturing responses that will be happening in the real world. So how does it actually work in practice? So what we designed with some very clever software developers in the US is a supermarket scene, because I was thinking, where would most 3-year-olds have gone with their parents that wasn't a kind of social context, and also I thought about a playground, but I thought actually from speaking to our advisory committees as well, our lived experience committees, the sound of a plane going overhead is not really what we're talking about day-to-day kind of difficulties. It's more, going to a supermarket, there being random announcements, the lights being very bright and things like that. So I thought actually it was quite a good approximation of real life. And so what they do is they're in this room which is set up to look like a supermarket, and as they walk around, it kind of walks around with you. And they are wearing a wireless fNIRS system for capturing their brain activity, and they're also wearing these small sensors that measure their heart rate. So you can look at brain response, but also physiological arousal to different things happening. And then they wear this glove, which lets them control, the eagle-eyed might be able to see this glove on the screen there. And what we ask them to do is a go, no-go paradigm, which is a very kind of classic, well-used executive function paradigm, where we say, as soon as this elephant, which you might be able to see there, maybe it's better back here. Yeah. The elephant will blow some bubbles out of its trunk. When you see a blue bubble, you pop it as quick as you can using the glove, which will control the mitten on the screen. But when it's a red bubble, try not to pop it. And it's much more effortful to not pop the bubble because you're having to inhibit this kind of prepotent or learned response. And in adult paradigms in the literature, this is thought to be pressing on your prefrontal cortex, because it's kind of where executive functions are thought to be localized. So when you have to inhibit your response, it's much more effortful and you get more activity in the prefrontal cortex. So what we designed was kind of a regular noise condition, which was 62 decibels, and then a loud noise condition, which was 72 decibels. And just to give some examples, I find quite helpful as to contextualize what that is. So a passenger car traveling fairly fast at 25 feet away is 77 decibels. A motorway, when you're 50 feet away from the pavement, 76. Living room music, 76. A radio, TV audio, or a vacuum cleaner is 70. So I'll play them and hopefully you can get a sense. But basically we wanted it to be noticeably noisier, but not distressing, which, having had people from our advisory committee come, and we did quite a lot of piloting, I think we've hit that brief. So it's not too noisy for anyone, but you can definitely feel that it's noisier, if that makes sense. So this would be the regular condition. Can see how you pop the bubbles there, and this is the noisy or the loud one. I don't know if you can tell the difference, those of you watching at home, but basically there is a 10 decibel difference. There are more people in the louder condition to mimic kind of a busier supermarket. Okay, and then just what we kind of learned whilst we're developing this, because this is completely new, so there's no kind of literature to go on as to how to design a virtual reality space for toddlers to look at sensory processing. So our advisory committees were incredibly helpful, and we also have some autistic colleagues in the department who very kindly came and listened and told me what they thought. And so they said the experience was on the spectrum of scenarios that may trigger sensory overload, but wasn't too much. So I guess it's realistic, but it's not true what it is, because that would be way too much for the children. They also suggested that we could make the auditory sound back a bit more realistic, so it's not just the volume getting louder, but also there should be multiple layers of sound in the supermarket. So we added some trolley noise and some announcements. Then we also wanted their advice about how we could make this very new, slightly odd environment more accessible for young children, and specifically for neurodivergent children. And so we developed some preparation materials. So we have videos and storyboards and lots of different resources to send to families to reduce anxiety and uncertainty. And then just another kind of further point that I won't really get into, but originally when I wrote the grant, I thought we would change not only the auditory aspect, but the visual aspect too. And I was thinking, oh, well, we could make it more bright, and that would be the kind of condition that would mimic kind of sensory overload in a way. But actually, I started designing some things and talking to people from our advisory committee, and it turns out, as someone naive like me, that who doesn't really have lived experience of kind of sensory overload, was that it's not just things being brighter, which sounds so obvious now, but it's about the visual clutter, it's about the contrast between things. And so I actually end up deciding that is a whole project in itself, which needs like its own time and dedication to work on. So let's just keep it with just changing the auditory for now, and we'll come back to the visual input and really work through that with our advisory committees. And then, just in case there's anyone on the call who's testing toddlers, we found that 10 minutes is optimal. It's absolutely no more than that, because they really do lose interest. There are things you can do to kind of improve data quality, like elastic bands, and then technical stuff like adding event markers, so that if children need a break, which we put a pause button in, you don't lose your data if you just need to pause and stop for a bit. And we also developed some visual schedules and a levels button. So we split the task into 3 levels, and when they complete each level, they get to put a sticker on here, and also it comes on the screen saying like level 1 completed, and everyone gives them a round of applause. And that really helps, because at the beginning I was saying, oh, it's just 5 minutes, and then I realized a 3-year-old has no idea what 5 minutes means. So really trying to make things more visual and concrete has been helpful. So then what can we do with this information? So then it means that we can look at actually what's going on in the moment in these children when they are encountering kind of enhanced sensory input. So when it's getting noisier, what's happening in terms of their physiological arousal, their heart rate, but also what's happening in terms of their brain response. Is the prefrontal cortex, that we think might be really important for regulating arousal and emotion, is that more active when you're under conditions of enhanced sensory input? And because they're doing this go and no-go task whilst it's getting noisier and quieter around them, you can then also ask questions like, is it harder to do the task when it's noisier? Is it more distracting? Does the prefrontal cortex have to work harder? Do we see more activation when you're trying to inhibit your behavior, but it's noisier versus when it's quiet? So it really allows us to pull apart some kind of basic questions about how do people respond to noisier conditions, and what does that do to their task performance or their attention. But then we can dig into individual differences. So are the children whose parents tell us are having a lot of more sensory challenges, or are more sensory hyper responsive, are those the ones whose heart rate is going up much more when they're in this experimental condition? Is their prefrontal cortex working more or working less? Does that mean that, does that tell us anything about how difficult or how hard they're finding it to regulate their arousal in different sensory environments? So loads of questions you can ask in a context which we hope is a bit closer to real life, because you could ask these questions using just like a boring standard EEG experiment, but I don't know how much it actually tells you about people's real life experiences. Okay, and then my very talented postdoc, Farah, has put in some information about fNIRS processing, which is kind of way above my bandwidth and expertise, but I just thought I would include it in case there are fNIRS people in the call. But also, I thought these pictures were quite helpful in giving a kind of visual sense as to where on this scalp we're measuring brain activity. So really a lot focused over the prefrontal cortex, but then we also have measurements over the left and right kind of temporal and parietal areas as well. And basically from this fancy processing pipeline, but from using fNIRS, you get a measurement of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, which are kind of a proxy estimate for neural activity in these different regions. And what we do is we estimate these things. So we have a rest condition where we just say, like, there's like a star on the screen. We say, oh, the elephant's just loading up some more bubbles for you. You can just, relax and wait for the bubble to come. And then we have the condition where they would pop somewhere between 9 and 11 bubbles, depending on how quick they are. And that's where we're analyzing the data from. So it's the kind of change from rest to the condition where they're popping bubbles and it's noisy or it's quiet. Okay, so generally, how's it going? So we've seen about 80 children, and the feedback has been really, really positive, which I am so pleased about because, as I said, it's very novel and no one had really done this sort of thing with toddlers before. But the children really like it. They like playing the games. The parents find it really interesting to see how their child's responding to different sensory inputs, and generally, the virtual reality is going pretty well. So I thought I would just give some really rough demographics, even though this is actually just from 70 people, because this is the most recent kind of data download I did. We do need to see 150, so it's only 50% of the sample. But you can see that we have a perfectly even ratio of males to females, which we didn't kind of plan for. That's just how it shook out, which is great. We have a mix of different ethnicities. We have a not representative median household income. The median in the UK, I think, is about 30,000. So we need to do a bit of work on representativeness in that case. We have about 12% of the sample have a family history of autism, which we've operationalized as having a first degree relative, so either an older sibling or a parent, with a confirmed or suspected diagnosis. About 20% family history of ADHD, fairly average IQ. And then what I thought was interesting to include here is this is our metric of sensory hyperresponsivity. So this is using a fairly detailed questionnaire, which wasn't available when kind of other studies were looking at prevalence, because they're like 10 years ago, maybe. So it's validated, it's psychometrically sound, and the developers provided us some cutoffs based on general population samples as to what they thought would be kind of an elevated score. And even though we haven't sought out these children, when we advertise the study, it's just about sensory processing. How does your child learn about the sensory world? About 18% are scoring above this threshold for kind of elevated or clinically significant scores, which I thought was quite interesting. Just in terms of thinking about maybe this is relevant to a larger proportion of children than most people are aware of. We also asked parents about the impact of sensory responsivity on different areas of their lives. And I thought this might be interesting for people to see that the areas that are being endorsed the most, I haven't done any statistics on it because I want to wait until we've got our final sample, but just from eyeballing it, it does look like eating, self-care, and sleep might be more impacted by sensory differences. And this questionnaire we actually developed with our lived advisory committees because there wasn't anything out there. And so we kind of got everyone to think about different areas that could be impacted by sensory processing and then made a questionnaire like that. So I'll be really interested to see what we find there. And then in terms of the brain data, so we have 70 people who've come through. About 67 of the children wore the cap and finished the task. And then if we put the restriction in, had enough trials and good data, it's about 57. But we do have people who did the task and there was some technical issues in terms of event markers, but we think that can be fixed. So actually, I think that number will go up a little bit. And I just had a quick look to make sure that the children who we do have fNIRS data from and we don't have any fNIRS data from, there aren't kind of big differences between them because that would be a bit of a worry. There's not any evidence in terms of age or IQ or autistic traits. That sensory hyperresponsivity difference is not significant, but it's kind of heading that way, which just from testing, I think also makes sense. Children who are much more sensitive to sensory experiences do find it a bit much, sometimes wearing the cap and putting this glove on. So we do split visits or yeah, we try and do as much as we can to make sure they can be included, but it's definitely, yeah, something that kind of requires a lot of thought and resources there. And then I think I'll skip and I'll just show you this one. So this is the brain response to go minus go. So you can think of it as when you're trying to do those blocks where you have to inhibit your behavior. So that's more effortful. So we would expect greater prefrontal cortex activation there anyway, regardless of the context. But then it's looking at what is the difference in that response when it's noisy versus when it's quiet. And you can see the red solid line is the oxygenated response to when it's noisy, and the red dashed line is when it's quiet. So it's looking like right in the middle of the prefrontal cortex, actually there is greater prefrontal cortex activation when you've got to inhibit your behavior when it's noisy versus when it's quiet. And we also see some other effects in the left superior temporal gyrus, which we need to dig into a bit more. But very promising that actually that is kind of in line with what we thought, that maybe it is just more effortful to do a task when it's noisy around you. And that's reflected in increased prefrontal cortex activity. So just to bring it to an end, because I know I am nearly at time, around 20% of the 3-year-olds in our sample did score above threshold for elevated levels of sensory responsivity, which I think is really interesting. Virtual reality and wireless brain imaging is possible with 3-year-olds. It can be tricky, but it definitely gets you closer to real life and therefore what is actually happening when young children experience and process incoming sensory information. And then that last effect I just showed you, that there's greater activation of the prefrontal cortex when you're trying to inhibit your behavior in a noisy versus a quiet environment. That could tell us either that it's more effort because it's more distracting when it's noisier, or there's greater activation because you need more to control your arousal because when you're in a noisy environment. So linking it with our measurement of physiological response of heart rate will begin to untangle these questions and try and figure out what's going on there. So we're kind of nearly-ish done with wave 1, and the children are starting to come back. And I've just been thinking about other things we want to measure, and I thought I'd just put it here in case anyone had any thoughts. I thought it was interesting. We might try and do some measure of children masking their sensory response. That's something our lived experience committee is very keen on. We'll want to try and get some measurement of response to predictable versus unpredictable sensory input. And we want to try and develop this fun new task called the jellyfish game to try and measure tactile discrimination and combine it with eye tracking, as that's something that we really struggled with when they were a bit younger. So hopefully I've given you a kind of whistle-stop tour of this massive project and everything we're trying to measure in it. And hopefully in a few years' time, I'll be able to come back and tell you all the really interesting things we found, and that we've kind of made some headway in understanding what drives differences in sensory responsivity, but also the longitudinal data will tell us the impact of these early differences in sensory responsivity. And all of that will hopefully tell us how we can better support children who do show sensory differences to really, I guess, reach their full potential and thrive early in development. So I'll stop there and I'll say thank you so much. It really does take a massive team to do all this work. So I really want to thank all of my team who are here, all of the families participated, all the people who give their lived experience input, and the funders. And just a final shout out that we are actually looking for a parent to join our lived experience committee. So email me if you're interested. Thanks.
Vinny, that was amazing. Thank you.
There's
Thank you ever so much. There's just so much going on. I don't know if you know, I used to be a childminder. So I used to have 5 under 5s attached to me. And now I really want to bring a bubble blowing elephant to the supermarket. It was a lovely way of going through. You explained heightened sensory responsibility. You took us through, it started with the evil of hand dryers and moved on from there. About 20% of children having this heightened sensitivity. That's just a lot for me to go and think away. Talking about that direction from sensory to anxiety, and then the interplay of autism and ADHD, your work with the Wellcome Trust, particularly the power that the stakeholders have actually brought. Those with lived experience have changed how you do stuff so much for the better. It's a lovely piece of research. VR for toddlers. VR for toddlers is just a brilliant way of doing stuff. and the fact that you can't get a toddler to do anything for more than 10 minutes, and the parents are slightly obsessed about sleeping and eating. I mean, that's part of having toddlers. It's always been the way. Lastly, I've written down, there is greater brain activation when it's noisy. It can be seen when it's harder to do stuff because busy and noisiness takes over. And it's a very simple finding that when there is so much out there, just causing little issues up here. We have lots of questions going in. We've got questions in the webinar chat, and we've got questions in the Q&A. We have only about 4 minutes. So I'm just going to say, Lucy says, rather than a question, the results suggest that I might not be the only person who finds it harder to make decisions in noisy environments. Supermarkets, maybe they're designed to make bad decisions. Just saying, capitalism sucks. So the question I've got for you from Rena is, how did the children tolerate the fNIRS cap, and how long was the setup time? So this is a cap that measures the blood flow through brains.
Yes. Generally, they tolerate it well because they're very excited about the idea of popping bubbles from an elephant's trunk. Yeah. So I feel like we try and focus on all the fun they're going to get to do, and just describe it as kind of putting an astronaut's cap on before we go and play the game.
I love the fact that it's all gamified. It's so lovely.
So for some children, it's just an absolute no, and that's just what's going to happen. I think that's true even if the children, like some neurotypical children, are just not kind of feeling putting this random hat on their head.
Today's not a hat day. I understand that.
Yeah, so we try and do as much as we can. I think our success rate's definitely improved over time as we've learned kind of what works and what doesn't work. But I would say probably better than the EEG cap, actually. I think
EEG caps, but particularly the old EEG caps where you had to put on all the little bits and took forever to get on. I mean, even now the saline ones, they're just a bit damp. fMRI is at least nice and dry. Quick question, sort of methodology kind of thing. So about the MMN, that's the sort of beep, 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 beep thing. Is that perceptual, or is it a response to the brain spotting difference?
Yeah, I see this question coming from Jeff.
Oh, Jeff's got good questions.
Yeah, I mean, it depends whether you think the degree of like the amplitude in that response is indexing anything kind of meaningful in terms of your kind of processing of it, or if it's just like a noticing response.
I think it goes deeper into the philosophy behind it. Do we see things as things, or do we see things as things that are in creation, in movement? Again, one of those really big questions where I think psychology and philosophy start to get wonderfully muddled up.
Yeah, I think what you need is, ideal world is some sort of kind of heart rate measure or attentional capture at the same time. So you could dig into actually what that response, if it captures anything beyond just kind of noticing a difference in your environment.
I like that. Thank you. We have 30 seconds on one last question, which is, how do you think the sensory differences change when the prefrontal lobe frontal cortex is fully developed? I'm not sure mine is.
Well, I guess if you go back to the literature on kind of emotion regulation, then people kind of posit or argue that as the prefrontal cortex matures, so moving from kind of 3 years and older, then that is what's supporting more efficient or more effective emotion regulation. And if you think part of a sensory response is driven by arousal or an emotional response, then you would think the prefrontal cortex would also be relevant for understanding sensory responsivity, not just an emotional response to something or arousal, but it's kind of, people hadn't really looked at it so much because they're kind of different fields in a way. So I'm trying to bring them together in this project.
To bring them together. And may I say, now that I'm getting older and I know more 50-year-old men who are getting in touch with their emotions for the first time, it's not just a childhood thing. It's been so lovely to have you with us, Vinny. Thank you ever so much. I feel enlightened by this, and I hope everybody else has had a lovely lecture with us. At this point, we stop the recording. There we go.
Thanks.